The year is 1959. In just a few weeks, over 500,000 Singaporeans will head to the polls in a historic election. During the campaign, thousands of Singaporeans received this document from the People's Action Party. It was a 75-page manifesto telling everyone what they would do if they were elected. Within it, one bold promise was made.
The colonial government has failed miserably in housing the people, and the result is more and more slums.
As a result, our future government will inherit the heavy burden from previous governments.
But we are confident that we can produce more houses than the colonial government has produced at any period in the past.
Isn't that audacious? I would be more conservative, but not them.
The housing issue is an area that the colonial authorities had really struggled with. And yet the PAP were willing to write this in their manifesto.
How were they going to do it?
In post-war Singapore, the population was just under 1 million residents, 1/6 of what we have now. But instead of being spread out across the island, more than 70% of them lived here, in what was known as the municipal area. And because most people wanted to stay near the mouth of the Singapore River, where there was trade and infrastructure, about half of that 70% was squeezed into this even smaller area in the heart of the city. This historical map of Singapore was part of this rarely seen report that was prepared by the Singapore Improvement Trust, or SIT, the colonial government's urban planning authority. Titled The Housing Problem in Singapore, the 1949 report aimed to alert the Colonial Office back home in London to Singapore's deplorable housing conditions, stressing that 250,000 people need rehousing now. This was despite the fact that the SIT started constructing homes soon after the war in 1947.
We see scenes of really overcrowded streets, very dilapidated buildings. But the thing is, these images are all black and white. Photographs can only capture so much. It doesn't really do justice to what these conditions would have been like.
For an insight into what living in Singapore in the 1940s would be like, we sent some of the photos to be professionally colored.
Oh yeah, these are familiar sights. The color runs more vivid, especially the plants.
I was born 1st January 1948 in the slum.
Most of us will be living in this. So a place like this would probably house 5, 6, 7, 8 families. There was a corrugated zinc roof. It's all rusted. As you can see, some are leaking. All the partitions are just flimsy planks or cardboards, paper, anything that they can lay their hands on, and there's rubbish all over the place. There's no ventilation in all the houses. So disease, tuberculosis is quite common.
When I read this document, you have a sense that the colonial authorities were well aware that there were problems with housing. But there's also a sense that it was perhaps too big a task for them to handle.
And so, the SIT's 1949 report was sent to London, seeking assistance and financial support for a building program aimed at addressing Singapore's housing crisis.
But post-war, even if, let's say, I have the will and the desire to do something, I'm limited by what I can get and how much money I'm able to garner to buy materials to construct. So post-war development was pretty slow.
Remember that the SIT's report stressed that 250,000 people required rehousing urgently. Assuming a family of 5 stay in one housing unit, the SIT already needed to build 50,000 homes. At the same time, the population was also growing by roughly 50,000 annually, meaning that 10,000 more homes were needed each year. But between 1947 and 1959, the SIT only managed to build an average of 1,600 units per year. You can see that it barely made a dent. Following the model of social housing in Britain, the SIT built flats only for rent.
In Singapore, that period, that was considered quite a privilege. Resettle is a jackpot because there were so few flats being built. So for us, we consider very lucky. We resettled to ABC. They call it Alexandra Big Works Estate. But the quality of the flats was very mixed with, very basic, very Spartan.
The SIT, certainly they knew the bulk of the population are not wealthy, so they have to develop low-cost housing. So the initial roofing was actually tile roof, but post-war, there was also a tile roof shortage and led them to experiment with different kind of low-cost roofing materials, what we call asbestos corrugated roof sheets. Today, they're now banned in Singapore, right? Because the asbestos fiber is cancer-causing. It's actually bad for human health.
The roof was very skimpily nailed to the beams, 2 beams.
So whenever there's a heavy storm, rain, the roofs just get ripped off and people get injured or you sleep in the rain for days.
But it's a fast way and cost-effective way of providing housing.
There were many things that they had to grapple with, but really key to this was that it was not a democratically elected government.
Whereas if you look at the PAP manifesto, this is very much speaking to a population and wanting to win their support.
Really, housing had the best optics. The idea of new estates coming up is very visible to the electorate.
The housing section of the manifesto, which contained the PAP's bold promise, was actually a speech delivered by PAP candidate Ong Eng Guan at a political rally.
He was extremely popular because one of his promises was to actually clean up the city, and cleaning up the physical environment is one of the most visible effects of government. He was a bit of a showman. I mean, he would go and carry a broom and sweep the floor himself.
The PAP won the 1959 elections by a landslide, and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was installed as Prime Minister. Here, we see Mr. Lee leading the victory parade, and walking prominently by his side is Mr. Ong Eng Guan, who secured one of the highest vote shares of any candidate across all constituencies. Mr. Ong is then appointed Singapore's first Minister for National Development, which was the ministry overseeing housing and the SIT. His main task was to solve the pressing housing problem.
The SIT was deemed to be inefficient, so they essentially got rid of the SIT and set up HDB with local staff.
So it was estimated that almost 500,000 people needed housing. And it was the PAP's job to deliver that. And so the PAP and HDB then proceeded to get financing to get the housing program going.
But a rift soon developed between this star candidate and the rest of the PAP cabinet. In these 3 formally classified letters sent to London by Singapore's colonial governor, he singles Mr. Ong out, saying that his hasty and unsound measures as minister have embarrassed his colleagues and discredited him. The actions taken by Mr. Ong included humiliating heads of department, putting newly joined juniors in charge of large organizations such as the SIT, and the summary dismissal of a large number of senior civil servants. 4 months after PAP's resounding victory, it is revealed that Prime Minister Lee talks of taking departments away from Ong Eng Guan and putting them under then Deputy Prime Minister Toh Chin Chai. With the HDB, however, Mr. Lee had his eyes set on a rather unlikely choice: a businessman named Lim Kim San.
I, from the very beginning, have been watching the antics of Ong Eng Guan with great distaste. First and foremost, he was a mango maniac, and he didn't want anyone to be near him who can report to the Prime Minister. Ong Eng Guan was making a mess of things, and since I have been quite a vocal critic of Ong Eng Guan, they thought that, well, since you talk so much and you dislike him, probably you are the best chef. Go there and show what should be done.
This was announced in February 1960. and the once popular Ong Eng Guan lost direct control of the most important part of his ministry. In the first 3 years leading the HDB, Lim Kim San set bold housing targets, streamlined operations, and built a skilled, dedicated team.
I'm Dr. Jimmy Beng, and I'm the son-in-law of Mr. Lim Kim San. The person instrumental for getting him into politics was Dr. Goh Keng Swee. Dr. Goh and him were good friends. They were actually schoolmates in Raffles College. And presumably, Dr. Goh has seen his work in the private sector as a businessman and knows his character and his personality and knew that he could be depended upon. Mr. Lim knows about the slums, he knows about the overcrowding, because even as a businessman, he goes into many places. He's seen the difficult conditions which majority of the population were suffering. So when appointed as chairman of the housing board, that was the push for him to really get going. I think the most important thing about him is that he interacts with his staff. And when he interacts with his staff, he knows the problems well. And I think that's sort of a person. He goes to the point, attacks the problem, wants answers, and gets the answer.
No such thing as having to wait for committee to decide on anything. They will come up to me and I will just say yes or no, cutting off all red tape. And things were done quickly.
By April 1961, 14 months after Mr. Lim took over, the HDB had built an average of 2,112 units. That was more than what the SIT had built yearly for 13 years. But it was still far from enough.
There are all kinds of challenges. In the early 60s, there were quite a lot of local resistance against being resettled.
Resettlement is a very major problem. The only way we can build on that scale is to move people from one area and have a high-density sort of construction on the area that was vacated by squatters or single-story buildings.
There were several other issues. There's not enough technical people, there's not enough labor, construction labor, right? It's like a very sharp learning curve. You know, within 1 year, there is also a question of financing.
And as the Housing Board was grappling with these problems, they were dealt a further blow in May 1961.
I went through the Bukit Ho Swee fire in 1961, and my house was burned down. The day of the fire was actually a public holiday, and so most of the adults in the kampong would have been at home. The fire started on the other side of Tiong Bahru Road, what used to be called Sikating village, and then jumped over to Bukit Ho Swee, and then it burned all the way down to Havelock Road. Because at the edge of Havelock Road actually was a concrete building, so it never burned past that. We had 2 lorries parked in front of our house, so we basically throw whatever we can take onto the lorry, and we just drove out of that and took whoever who wants to get on, just get on, and then we drove out.
In just one afternoon, 16,000 people were left homeless.
The very next day, Mr. Lim had visited the site as chairman of Housing Board with the Prime Minister. And then they had made plans to get the people who were affected relocated, given various temporary housing and so on.
The rehousing was quite fast in a way because at that time, just as it happened, the government already had HDB flat built.
More than 40% of the victims were resettled in already completed HDB flats nearby. But there were still 10,000 waiting to be housed.
政府方面，國家發展部及建屋發展局也分別擬定計劃， 退在面，解決孤長徛厝的問題。
Mr. Lee later promised that all the fire victims would be rehoused in flats on the site of the fire within a year.
Bukit Ho Swee was really one of the really major early HDB projects. A very large piece of land in the urban area is now available. So the government changed the law, the land law, meaning they don't have to compensate anybody except for the land that they're acquiring.
This new law allowed the government to acquire the Bukit Ho Swee site at a pre-fire value in order to build public housing. The HDB then began a massive rebuilding program on the site of Bukit Ho Swee.
And this, believe it or not, is the same scene 9 months later. Many of the fire victims had already moved back and were installed in their new home.
And that gave rise to a belief that Housing Board purposely started this fire because they had the plans ready in such a short time, which was nonsense. I mean, the tragedy of a huge fire is terrible. It was possible because from the experience that we gained in the earlier years, the team of architects was able to draw up the program immediately. The idea is, well, we'll be able to build so many units and house so many people.
Now there are happier faces as housewives set out new belongings in homes they had least expected. Soon all Singapore's people will be housed in modern blocks like these, and the danger of such devastating fires will be gone forever.
The difference between SIT and HDB, right, is that the HDB has basically the full support of the government. So even though Singapore didn't really have that much money at the time, the PAP government was willing to put whatever financial resources it has into housing.
The SIT built 21,103 housing units in the 13-year post-war period from 1947 to 1959. Within its first 5 years, the HDB more than doubled the SIT's 13-year number, building a total of 54,430 units by 1965.
But the key to achieving this figure at a reasonable cost was standardization. Lim Kim San was keeping it simple in the first building phase. They really adopted a cookie cutter model and basically built units and built blocks exactly the same.
Here we have the 1960s, early 60s, the one-room emergency units.
These one-room emergency flats were the flats built on the site of the Bukit Ho Swee fire.
So you have a rectangular cellular unit, and you just repeat this rectangular cellular unit. It's easier and faster to construct. Here you have a double-loaded corridor, a passageway that serves 2 units, left and right. But imagine that you have many of these units that is continuing on both sides of left and right. The corridor will become a very dark and dingy and very long thoroughfare with light entering from the front and the back. If you look at the placement of the toilet is what we call internalized toilet. There's no window. So you have to rely on artificial lighting to use the toilet. And it's actually very difficult for the moisture in the toilet to be expelled, to dry the toilet.
His first few developments were all rental apartments. They were not as bad as slums, but they were generally filthy because they wouldn't care less, because it's everybody's property. So he told me, look, I've suggested developing the apartments for sale instead of rental to change the whole thing and to make Singaporeans house proud.
In 1964, the government launched the Home Ownership for the People scheme, initially aimed at lower to middle-income Singaporeans.
Mr. Lim knew at that time that if you want to sell, it must be affordable. So he decided the buying of an apartment is more or less equivalent to a good family car, say a Mercedes-Benz.
This was the article that came out in the papers the day the home ownership scheme was announced. 2-room units were priced at $4,900, requiring only a deposit of just $900.
So when HDB was started in 1960s, there are actually a lot of backlog to solve the housing crisis. When it comes to the 1970s, we have a greater expectation of how living conditions look like. So this is one of the very common three-room typology. Here we have a single loaded corridor. It's not a double loaded corridor. So the front of the house is exposed to the elements where the wind can actually enter through the main door when the main door is open. It represents a kind of evolution which the HDB designers and architects are experimenting with. How do we make life more pleasant for social housing and to make it a space where everyone can call home?
We settled from Brooks Estate to the HDB in Commonwealth Avenue. It's a three-room flat, meaning 2 bedrooms, 1 small kitchen. Oh, that was a big jump. It was near paradise. People don't understand. But for us, we own nothing from slum area to even the Spartan, skimpy, SIP flat. It's still good. Commonwealth Avenue, bonus, big day. It was paradise.
By the 1980s, most kampongs had disappeared, and in their place stand not just HDB blocks, but whole towns consisting of markets, schools, and parks. Today, 80% of Singapore residents call public housing home, a remarkable evolution from the overcrowded slums of the past.